you should definitely trust the experts. At least that's what we've been told repeatedly. In fact, anytime someone comes on and makes a particular statement, you'll oftentimes hear somebody automatically reply with, well, I didn't know you had a degree in X or whatever it happens to be. So there's this idea that there's a certain group of experts out there and we should listen to them. Well, on today's episode, we're actually going to talk about what actually constitutes expertise. How do you gain expertise? Should you trust the experts? And 20 times where the experts got it horribly wrong. Believe me, you're going to want to hear this. It's a combination of shocking and hysterical. All of this coming up on this episode.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Making the Argument. Like I said last episode, if you haven't already, head down to the description of this podcast episode and join us on Volley. We would love to hear from you what one of these 20 examples stands out to you as, I don't know, shocking, because there are a couple. But thank you again for joining us. We look forward to having you, and let's get started.
All right, as always, your host, Nick Freitas, member of the House of Delegates, other than that, reasonably good guy. My beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
Then we have our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian Hines.
Hey.
And then our producer, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that does not like central banking.
That's correct. Nick, what is an expert?
I am so glad you asked
I know.
that. I'm so glad you asked that. Oh my gosh, we happen to have a Merriam-Webster, website open right now.
Are they experts?
I guess so. That's actually a great question. So Merriam-Webster says the definition of expert: one with the special skill or knowledge representing mastery of a particular subject. So, and I think that most of us, when we think about an expert, that's kind of what we're thinking.
Seems
generally.
reasonable.
Seems reasonable. But there's all these heuristics that we use. We've used the term heuristic before, but essentially within economics or within anything, heuristics, think of it as kind of like a shortcut, right? So let me give you a quick example, right? When you guys went to college, you didn't research every single college on the planet, right? Yourself. You talked to people that had gone there before. You looked at various things that would provide you some indication based off of your personal preferences, etc. Right? Those were heuristics you used to make a decision, to make an informed decision. Well, we do the same thing with respect to expertise. So if someone has a PhD in a particular subject, we generally think of them as an expert within that field. If someone has a great deal of experience, so for instance, Elon Musk does not have a degree in engineering, right? He has like a bachelor's of arts, I think, in physics, which I was shocked. I didn't know you could get a BA in physics. And I think he's got a bachelor's of science in economics. But a lot of the work that he does, has to do with like high level engineering. We want to come back and say, well, Elon Musk doesn't know anything about it. He's not an expert in a particular field, or he's not an expert within this industry because he doesn't have a business degree, right? So we recognize that someone can be an expert in a field without necessarily having like, a particular degree status or conveyed upon them by an institution, right? And so that's an important distinction. And then you have some people that have both, right? They have a lot of formal education within a particular topic, but they also have a lot of practical experience within a field as well. And a lot of times we look at that as a good combination of factors. I know a lot of people that would take issue with the idea of describing experience as different from education. That's why we talk about it as formal education, like within the classroom, within a university system, et cetera. So I think we're all pretty comfortable with those as definitions of experts. Now, one of the things that I find is interesting, and actually Christian's going through his master's degree right now.
Soon I will become an expert.
Soon he will be an expert historian according to academia. But here's what's interesting. Even somebody that has a PhD within the field of history, if you look at how they got their PhD, you don't get your PhD from necessarily having a wide array of information of history in general. It's usually because you do your doctorate thesis on something very, very specific. And typically, correct me if I'm wrong, Christian, typically with a PhD program, they're looking for you to tackle a particular issue from a very unique position. You're not just regurgitating what everyone else has already written. So you've had to do this even for your master's that you're working on. You have to really narrowly focus on a particular area too, not just broad.
Oh yeah, every single paper is super, super specific. There's nothing that's in general, talk to us about World imperialism.
Yeah.
Instead, I would talk about, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and how that's an act of imperialism or something like that. so and that's just in history, right? But I do think that the same principle largely applies to other fields. My father is a college professor.
Yeah.
And I believe his doctorate thesis was about the lottery system in Louisiana. It wasn't about lotteries in general. It wasn't about the economics of the state of Louisiana. It was specifically about one topic.
Yeah.
And, you know, the late 1980s, early 1990s, the lottery system in Louisiana. And yet, by our standards, we would say, well, he has a PhD. He teaches business marketing. Therefore, he is an expert when we talk about marketing in general. And I do think he's actually a genuinely very intelligent person, but that doesn't mean that and I don't think he himself would claim that like he knows everything about economics in general. He knows a very specific subset, segment of that when it comes to specific types of marketing, and that's what he teaches.
Well, and I think, and that's the important distinction we want to talk about. And you can say the same thing about private sector expertise. So somebody could be a very, very successful business owner within a particular industry, and that would make them like. Let's do a perfect example of this. One president that I don't like very much, Republican president Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover was an expert within the mining industry. Like when it came to understanding like where to mine, how to do it, how to get it to market, like all the different logistics. He was an expert in those fields, and he was very good at surrounding himself with other experts in order to create, an entrepreneurial endeavor. Well, a lot of people looked at that as like, oh gosh, this is a guy that really understands the economy. Okay, well, he did within his narrow field of the economy, but when he got in there as president and tried to micromanage the economy, people always talk about Herbert Hoover like he was hands off. He was actually one of the first presidents in United States history that drastically intervened in the economy at the federal level and caused a lot of problems for it. And that was counterintuitive to people because, no, you're an economic expert. You're one of the richest people in the world. You're a success. That doesn't mean his expertise understands a broad range of economic principles.
Yes. I feel like that we see this a lot, like in our day-to-day lives. So like an example that I could give is like a real estate agent might be an expert in the Northern Virginia markets, but they don't know anything about the Shenandoah Valley.
Yeah.
They couldn't sell a house there because it's a completely different environment. There's not really a whole lot of apartments, mostly farmhouses and stuff like that. Completely different environment. But like on a broader scale, insofar as like, things that our audience would care about on a day-to-day basis, because it's part of the reason that they listen to this show, like think about all of the experts that go to like Davos every year or are part of like the World Economic Forum. And these are people that have made millions or in some cases billions in investments. And so therefore we say, oh, these people are geniuses. They're experts when it comes to economics. They're experts when it comes to the marketplace. But then they'll go out there and they'll say things that would, quite frankly, their ideas about how the economy should be run or formulated or operated or managed would lead to catastrophic disaster. Quite frankly, I think of all of those people, and we've done episodes on this podcast talking about the World Economic Forum. All these people, and some of these people that are hailed as experts, we've actually, I believe that you've collected some quotes from them on that 20, the list of 20 people. There's some people out there that are geniuses when it comes to investing. But suddenly, when they make pronouncements about, well, this is what policy should look like from a fiscal or monetary or just broadly economic viewpoint, suddenly their record as an investor is supposed to carry weight insofar as what sort of laws should be passed and regulations should be adopted, when in reality, what they're calling for is just managed markets, that just more central planning, basically. But therefore, because they're an expert, they know what they're talking about. And this is the problem with it's taken many different forms. This is the problem with what people like to call like scientific socialism.
Yeah.
Or or a form of meritocracy that's not simply put the most qualified people in the best positions, but put the most qualified people in positions that will then control everything. That's not necessarily a meritocracy, because it's a form of central planning. Because at the end of the day, you could be Rockefeller, or you could be Carnegie, or you could be Buffett, or you could be Bezos, or whoever these people are, but their individual knowledge does not it might be greater than any one person.
Yeah.
Warren Buffett might be the single most intelligent investor in the entire world.
Yeah.
But his knowledge pales in comparison to the collective knowledge of billions of people making their own private decisions. And that's the problem with central planning. And I think that needs to be pointed out, because the reason that we're talking about the whole flaws with don't trust the experts is because ultimately what we're trying to do in today's episode is dismantle one of the strongest arguments that people put forward in favor of central planning.
Well, and I think that, and this goes into, so all of that's makes perfect sense. And it goes into the whole idea of understanding bias, right? Because everybody, there's this idea that, oh, well, no, they have a PhD in this, it's objective, or they're a scientist. Neil deGrasse Tyson is kind of famous for kind of like suggesting that the way the country really should be run is that we just go with whatever the science says. And a bunch of people are coming forward going, wait a second. Scientists don't approach a topic or a subject matter completely devoid of bias.
Right.
They have their own biases with respect to the value of certain data. They have biases with respect to what they think would be a favorable outcome.
If you're an expert that works for Pfizer,
yes,
you have a bias.
Yeah, and that's the whole. So understanding the bias is really important here, and again, there's some people think all these experts stink. Essentially, we shouldn't listen to them. What we should do is understand what they're saying, why they're saying it, and one of the most important components here is because you have public sector experts, you have private sector experts. Right, so like Warren Buffett would be considered more of a private sector expert. A public sector expert would be considered someone like the head of the CDC, right, or Dr. Fauci. Like these are considered public sector or government sector experts. And what we've seen, and I think what a lot of people have gotten frustrated with, is this bias component that enters into it. Where now, if I have two people and theoretically both of them have an argument to be made for why they're subject matter experts in a particular field. But one of them is saying the government approved thing and one of them is not. Which one gets banned from Twitter? Which one gets thrown off of YouTube? Which one gets expelled from the public space for hurting or for damaging public safety? Right? That's the part where a lot of us look at this and go, wait a second, you are now crossing the boundary. If your expert is as good as you think they are, then not only were the data reflect reality, but you shouldn't need to silence everybody else. Yeah. Now the counter argument to a lot of this is, well, people put out really bad information, and a lot of times people have a tendency to want to believe bad information, and so that's how we got to protect against. To which, again, my response to that is, I will admit that is true. I will admit there are people out there that are highly charismatic that say a lot of stupid things. Right? Does that mean we should shut them down because they're wrong or inaccurate? And then who gets to decide who's wrong and inaccurate? Because I think AOC says a lot of dumb things. But I wouldn't dream of saying, and that's why she should be kicked off the internet. But they don't have a problem doing the same thing. And I would say that to me, that's a huge hit on your, quote, expertise. If the only way that your thesis or your theory can win out in society is if you shut down everybody else. And
I wanted to say one thing
Yeah.
is that I do feel like there is also a component here that you have to consider when you're looking at some of these experts is what type of incentives do they have to come to a certain conclusion. So, for instance, we've got Pfizer and Dr. Fauci, and he's basically saying, you don't get to know whether or not I get my investors or my
royalties.
Whether or not I'm getting kickbacks or money from this. And I'm sorry, but you can have the biggest virtue signal in the world and talk about public health and all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, do you get a kickback for this? Are you making money on this particular outcome? A lot of the climate change experts and things like that.
Yeah.
It's accepted science. These are the accepted experts. But then you have experts within the field who are shunned from the rest of the experts. I mean, scientists against scientists.
Joe Rogan has had a few on.
Yeah. And so it is something where you've got this body of experts who are making a good amount of money over here doing what they're doing and convincing the public of what they're convincing them of. And it's basically kind of an economic setup where they're trying to bar entry into the thought market and stop other ideas from coming in, because other ideas will cause them to shrink and make less money or have less influence. And so they want to continue to promote what it is that they've been pushing. So,
and this is the part where people get very frustrated with this idea that, well, this bad information got put out there. It's like, okay, I get that. And you're never going to be able to stop that. You're never going to be able to stop bad information getting out. You can centralize what information gets out, but every society that we've seen that's attempted to do that, who's the centralized power that decides what's good information and bad? The government. And then ultimately what the government thinks is good information gets out, and it turns out that information validates whatever the politicians controlling the government are doing. It's like, it's so Orwellian, but so obvious. And it's amazing to me the number of people. There was recently an article, it was some New York magazine, I think, where they were talking about the need to regulate speech because, big lies around politics. This is dangerous speech, and so we need to regulate. Okay, who's going to regulate it? Oh, well, the government. Oh, so the people in power will now regulate the big lies of the people that are running against them. Like, you don't see the obvious problem with that. And so again,
the First Amendment was set up so that we could protect differing political viewpoints and speech along those lines.
And this goes to the other thing that happens frequently now. We see it all the time on our page. We see it on the time with our podcast. Like, oh, Nick, I didn't know you had a degree in economics. I don't. And this is the part that, again, if you don't like somebody's argument, typically what you should do is you should dissect the evidence that they used in order to come to a conclusion, in order to demonstrate why either the evidence was flawed or the premise was flawed or the conclusion was flawed, right? That's the logical thought process that we use to distinguish between a good argument or good evidence and bad arguments and bad evidence. And the only way that you can really effectively do that is within a free market of thought and ideas and speech. And yet we have a lot of people coming in, and their instant response when you say something they don't like is, oh, I didn't know you had a degree in that. Or I didn't know you were an expert in that.
Oh, I love that. I didn't know you had a degree in economics. Paul Krugman has a degree in economics.
Yeah. Well, the thing I like to go back with is, okay, you're asking me a question right now. I didn't know you had a degree in journalism. Are you qualified to interview me right now on this topic?
That's actually a great one.
Because here's what it comes, this is what's known in logic as an appeal to authority fallacy. And an appeal to authority fallacy simply says that because someone is in a position of authority, now that could be political authority, it could be academic authority, it could be this realm of expertise, that because they've said something and because they're an expert, therefore that thing that they said is correct. It's like, no, in a logical world, when a recognized expert says something, what that should mean is that there's a higher degree of probability that it will be correct.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's correct. And it certainly doesn't mean that because they said it as an expert, it's correct. And yet that's how it's being treated. And what I really find concerning is I see more and more younger people talking about these things, especially after COVID, especially the kids that really grew up during COVID, formative years, is this idea of we have to trust the experts. No, or we have to trust science. And what they mean by science is whatever the government-approved scientists are saying about a particular topic. Science is not a person. Sorry, Dr. Fauci. Science is a process. It's a methodological process for trying to, look at observable reality and come to conclusions, rational conclusions about why things happen and help us design responses to those things or predict what could potentially happen in the future. Right? That's what science is. It's a methodological process. But more and more, I'm seeing people treat it as if, no, it's a person or it's an institution. And if they say it, therefore it's science. Or if they say it, therefore it's fact. And that is a very, very dangerous way to look at the concept of expertise.
Oh, especially because when there's billions of dollars sloshing through the system in order to pay for whatever is recommended by these scientists, it's like it's a self-licking ice cream cone. Oh, you've got this, it's just a vicious cycle. And nobody wants to follow the money. And I feel like there's certain fields where people go, oh, but people in this field are there for entirely, wonderful, good-hearted reasons, and they would never.
They're not motivated by profit.
They're not motivated by
motivated
that.
By public service.
So they won't follow the money. But when you're looking at the billions and billions of dollars that we're just sloshing through to get everybody jabbed and everything else, it's just, you're going, But then there's no difference between they continually will lie to the public or mislead the public and then are never held accountable for it. Why? Because they are a government entity. For some reason, when the government puts their experts into place, they're never held accountable for being wrong.
Well, and that's a good point. I want to talk about that before we go into the 20 times the experts got it wrong, because that's going to be a lot of fun. You're not going to believe some of this stuff. But a lot of people say, well, okay, if you're motivated by profit, therefore that's not good science. And really what we should take into consideration is, because someone gets paid to do something does not mean they're bad at it, right? In most cases it means they're good at it, especially if it's in the private sector. Because in the private sector, you tend to not get paid for something unless you have some sort of track record for producing positive results. Now, in the government sector, you can get paid all day for screwing things up regularly.
Right.
In certain academic sectors, you can get paid all day for screwing up things regularly. In fact, if you want a really good book on this, Thomas Sowell's Intellectuals and Society, he does a great job looking at this. But the whole idea is that people will say, oh, no, you complain about, or I've had people get mad at me before. They're like, why don't you want the government to support science? I'm like, I think the government should support science. I think the best way to do it is to create a free and open environment where you protect people's property rights, you protect people's ability to, go out and experiment and share ideas. That's great. No, we want more funding. I'm like, okay, well, now if you're talking about more government funding for science, now what you're essentially doing is you're saying the government is going to prioritize the sort of science that is conducted, and generally speaking, the sort of conclusions those scientists will come to.
Yeah.
Because you don't get to tell me that when the government says, hey, we're going to allocate $1 billion for climate change research in order to, blah, 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 blah. And they came up with all these policy objectives. And now we're going to issue that as a grant. Well, now I got a bunch of people competing for the grant. Who do you think is going to win the grant? Or do you think is going to repeatedly win the grant, year after year after year? Is it going to be the people that come to the conclusions that the politicians wanted? Or is it going to be the people that maybe come to conclusions the politicians didn't want? Like this idea that money just goes out there and all we want is the objective truth.
Right.
Spare me. The other thing
if your conclusion basically eliminates your job, there is a really bad motivation
there's perverse incentive there.
Right.
And the other side is on the private sector. People will look at like, is private sector science better? Well, that's still being motivated by dollars because I need money to research. And the answer is both of them are capable of corruption. Both of them, public sector and private sector. The difference with public sector is I'm not asking you before I take your money and then give it over to these guys.
Well, and they can also continually be wrong, whereas the market will usually adjust quickly to an expert in the private sector being wrong.
Yeah,
if they're wrong, they pay the price immediately.
Well, because a lot of what you see in private sector science is applied sciences, right? It's not just I want to divine a new theory about this. It's how does the science you're conducting actually provide benefit to a good or a service?
There's also
or future profit.
Let's also remember that sometimes you have a motivation for something to happen a certain way, and so therefore you leverage your credentials in order to argue for it.
Yeah.
So a really good example of this was when Jerome Powell was out there saying inflation is going to be transitory. He knew that it wasn't transitory, but he was leveraging his position as chairman of the Federal Reserve to argue that it was. And the reason why was because, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It was bad in one sense, but the reason that he was trying to mitigate concerns about inflation was because, in part, if the public expects inflation to kick in, well, then inflation will kick in.
Yeah.
Prices will go up, and the purchasing power of the dollar will go down if people expect it to be so. This is what happened in the 70s because inflation was going on for so long that people just kind of baked it into their calculus of how to budget properly. And so Powell was trying to say, oh, inflation's transitory. We don't think it's going to be an issue. Trust me, I'm an expert. I'm the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Even though he knew that was totally bogus because he was trying to mitigate people's concerns about it.
Well, and
he was trying to tamp down panic.
Yeah.
Yes, that doesn't change the fact, though, that he was wrong.
Yeah.
Now, he was trying to do some PR stunt in order to stop a panic from happening at the same time that he was planning on ramping up rate hikes. What he thought was going to happen was the Federal Reserve was going to raise interest rates to get rid of inflation before the public could catch on that it was going to happen.
Yeah.
And none of that worked out at all, right? His whole plan blew up in his face. But
and he's not paying the price, really.
And he's not paying the price at all for it.
And he wasn't just wrong. He was purposefully wrong.
Oh, he was also the guy who was in many case is responsible for the inflation in the first place. So this goes back to, I love bringing this up from Thomas Sowell, right? You're putting power in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong. Jerome Powell literally paid no price for being wrong on the inflation thing. And there's so many examples of this. I know that you've got a giant list that we're going to get to, but like it's worth bringing that up before we start going into any of these quotes, that like the motivations for why the experts are wrong could vary between the circumstances.
Yeah.
But that doesn't change the fact that there's so many instances where people in positions of authority say things that are incorrect. Sometimes maybe because they're trying to do something good and they're trying to stop a panic, but that doesn't change the fact that their pronouncements are not true.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that we should take what they're saying at face value.
No, and in fact, I think the important thing to remember, and that is a good point, and we had this conversation once on predicting stuff in politics, because you were looking at it from a very like kind of outside objective, this is what the data says. And I was looking at it from the perspective of, hey, we're trying to win this race. And again, it's one of those things where somebody can be in a position of authority and have good intentions and put something out that they hope is true or that they hope will work. But like you said, they're using their expertise to try to manipulate a situation. And that's why no matter who the expert is, there's always you can never surrender your own logic to the experts, right? Because if an expert truly is an expert, they don't mind the scrutiny. If they're confident in what they believe, they don't mind the scrutiny. The moment they're like, we need to shut you down because what you said is contradicting what I've said, that's the person that your red flags need to go up. Your red flags need to go up right away and say, there's something about this that I potentially cannot trust, not because they don't have a PhD, not because they don't have experience within a particular field, but because their main avenue for ensuring the dominance of their position or argument is to shut down their competition. That's what should throw up red flags instantaneously. All right. I want to move on to this
20
expert.
examples. I'm looking forward to
20
this.
examples. All right. Here we go. This one comes from Harvard This was made around 1970. So a lot of these were actually made in conjunction with the first Earth Day. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So Harvard biologist George Wald. So right off the bat, right? He's a biologist. So you're thinking, okay, that's some credibility with respect to an environmental issue. And Harvard, right? One of the premier universities in the world. Harvard biologist George Wald estimated that civilization will end within 15 or 30 years unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind. Now, let's look at a couple things of that statement. We look at that now like, okay, that seems super ridiculous. Now, in 1970, you had a lot of bad predictions with respect to the environment, but you also had the Soviet Union, the United States.
I was about to say, I don't know why we have this on the list. He was totally right. The Soviet Union was an existential problem facing mankind, and it was dealt with within 15 to 30 years of that prediction being made.
I don't think that's what he meant, though.
Well, I mean, the same type of predictions are being made now. I mean, you've got 5 years ago, all these students were in harassing, what was her name? It wasn't Barbara Box. Dianne Feinstein, saying the world is going to end in 12 years. 12 years. And it's like, well, it's been 5. We've only got.
They'll always come back, and I had a buddy of mine that he used to say, he goes, watch, Nick, because they're just going to come back in 20 years and say, we did it. We did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you look at what he's saying here, civilization will end within 15 or 30 years. Well, first of all, you've doubled your projection. Right, I'm always a little bit skeptical when somebody says this could happen in 200 to 400 years or 3 to 5 billion years. Like, okay, that's a little bit of margin error. He goes, unless immediate action is taken against problem facing. Okay, what are the immediate actions? What immediate actions? What immediate actions need to take place that is going to prevent the wholesale wiping out of civilization in 30 years?
Well, they never quite vocalize the specifics of the immediate actions so that whatever action is taken solves the problem.
So that was exactly. So that was an academic expert. Here we go. Private sector expert. Ken Olson, president, chairman, and founder of Digital Equipment Corp, made this statement in 1977. There is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home.
Wow.
We say this with 4 computers on this desk right now.
And he was the maker of big business mainframe computers.
Yep. arguing against the PC in 1977. So again, what was his incentive structure?
What was happening in 1977? Was Microsoft open then?
Well, you had like a lot more of like the smaller computers were starting to emerge on the market in the 80s. But you had people theorizing because again, these large computers that were used like during the space program.
They took up like an entire room.
Oh yeah, and so is this. But this guy was making big business mainframe computers. He's having to get investors for what he's trying to do,
Right.
and people are probably asking, "Well, what about these new smaller computers or home computers?" No, that's not a big deal. All right, let's look at this one. Oh gosh, this guy is one of my favorite, and he appears on this list several times. Okay, Paul Ehrlich. This guy is like he's like the Malthus of our time, like predicting doom and gloom. He goes, population will inevitably completely outstrip whatever small increases in food supplies we make. He confidently declared in April 1970 issue of Mademoiselle, the death rate will increase until at least 100 to 200 million people per year will be starving to death in the next 10 years. So he made this prediction in the 70s. Yeah, April 1970. The death rate will increase until at least 100 to 200 million people per year will be starving to death during the next 10 years. So not only did that not happen, we had like massive population explosion as well.
And resources.
Yeah.
Well, and now government entities are so confident with the food supply that they're trying to cut the food supply down.
I mean, in many ways, he could not have been more wrong because the problem that we now have is population declines, mostly in Western developed countries where the birth rate has just completely fallen off a cliff. Elon Musk, expert, talks about this all the time. No, that's not to say that it's true.
Yeah.
In fact, don't even take my word for it because I'm not an expert on demographics. But
they were saying it's simple math.
But just look at the birth rates. But I do notice how some of these arguments, the solution that's always implicitly or in some cases explicitly presented is massive government control over society. Because if I recall, Paul Ehrlich advocated for all sorts of I think he himself described it as various forms of coercion, like population controls and taxes on people having additional, like he would have been thrilled with China's one child policy or something like that. Yeah. And that's just something to keep in mind with some of these predictions, that a lot of the people throwing them out, they or their acolytes have a solution in mind, and that solution is never free markets and individual liberty. No. It never is.
No. All right, let's look at this next one. Let's so that was academic experts. Let me see here. Let's go to I want to pick another one here. All right. This one I want to ask everyone here at the table. Don't read the notes. Don't read the notes. All right. The London Times in 1894 predicted that London would be buried under 9 feet of what?
I can't answer this one.
I know this one.
You told me yesterday.
All right, what is it?
So.
The date gave it away. Horse manure.
Horse manure. That's right.
Why did the date give it away?
Wait, horse manure?
Or just manure in general. He said manure in general, but it was because of horses.
Oh.
But it was in 1894 predicted that basically 56 years later, it would be covered under 9 feet of manure. The reason why is the population was growing because of the Industrial Revolution.
More people needed carriages and horses.
More people needed carriages and horses. And they predicted it based off of what was currently going on without anticipating future innovation, technology.
Changes. Yeah. They thought that by the 1940s and 50s, they would still be riding around in horses and carriages in London. And by the 1940s and 50s, there were no more horses and carriages in London. Well, there were a couple for tourist reasons, but that was it.
Well, and this just goes to show, too, that
and now they've replaced manure with water. And they're going to say that we're going to be covered in water because of climate change. See?
Well, the interesting part is that a lot of these guys, when they make these incredible predictions, they also don't take it. They assume that the current state of technology, innovation, that's going to remain constant. That's going to stay. And
As if anything ever remains constant for that long.
Yeah. All right.
Although things really did explode in the past century.
Yeah.
I mean, we really did come so far.
Yeah. As we said before, we went from inventing flight or discovering flight with the Wright brothers to within one lifetime landing on the moon.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Wow.
That's incredible. It was less than 80 years between the Wright brothers. No, less than 70 years between the Wright brothers and man walking on the moon. And that's incredible.
That's if you believe that really happened.
All right, here we go. I want to know, okay, this is from Decca Recording Company in 1962, and I want you guys to guess who they were talking about. We don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out.
The Beatles.
I think the 1962 gave it away.
Yeah.
It was about the Beatles. Decca Recording Company said that about the Beatles in 1962.
Yeah, and the Beatles were a total flop.
And
just
they're
like you said.
experts.
Yeah, they're experts.
They know
man.
everything about music.
Yeah, they're experts.
Yeah.
All right. Dennis Hayes, the chief organizer for Earth Day in the spring of 1970 issue of The Living Wilderness, said it is already too late to avoid mass starvation. Now, again, keep in mind that when Malthus was making these similar predictions, like or in the 1800s, like the population of the world in 1800 was a little over 1 billion people, and about 80 to 90% of them were living in extreme poverty. Right. And you look at the state of technology and everything else that date, that's why they were saying, oh my gosh, we're seeing, exponential population growth, but we can only grow so much food. And what are we going to do? Okay, well, in 2020, there was 7 billion people, but only 20% of them were living in extreme poverty. So the exact opposite happened with what they were predicting. And again, as Christian pointed out, and this is very important to understand, with a lot of the academic or political experts, not as much with the private sector, but to some degree, with a lot of the public sector experts, government sector experts, and academic experts, what they're almost always advocating for is they're projecting out a problem, they're showing you data based off of long-term models without a great deal of insight into how technology is going to change, and then they're always advocating for more government control. Almost always advocating for more government control. All right, here we go.
I love this one, actually. The greatest expert of all time in many ways.
Yeah, here we go. In fact, we're going to put out there who said this. There is not the slightest indication that nuclear energy will ever be attainable. It would mean that the atom would have to be shattered at will. Who said that?
Albert Einstein.
Albert Einstein in 1932.
Arguably the smartest man to have ever existed. He was also wrong about quantum mechanics. He wrote that paper, I think it was like the EPR thesis, where he argued that quantum mechanics was like incomplete and in large part because he thought it was incompatible with general relativity, and he ended up being wrong about that as well. He like mocked the whole, I'd like to believe the moon is there even when I don't look at it. And like, and again, smartest person ever.
Yeah.
And yet one of the most revolutionary things that was ever discovered in the field of physics, he dismissed it almost completely and spent like almost his entire later half of his life like trying to disprove quantum mechanics or argue that it was an incomplete field. And yet we still hold him up in extremely high regard today, and in many cases rightfully so. But it just gets to the point that you might have maybe a higher degree of being correct in your pronouncements as an expert, at least if you're within the field that you're in. I would not trust Albert Einstein to give me any advice when it comes to the real estate market.
Yeah.
But like that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be right 100% of the time.
Yeah. Let's go to another one by Paul Ehrlich.
Oh my gosh, him again.
And again, this is amazing because this guy is still held up as someone to listen to. Like, please understand, when we read these off, and you'll notice that Paul shows up here quite a bit. He's one of these academic experts. To this day, he is someone that people will go to and say, well, Paul Ehrlich said. He sketched out his most alarming scenario for the 1970 Earth Day issue of The Progressive, assuring readers that between 1980 and 1989, some 4 billion people, including 65 million Americans, would perish in the Great Die-Off. So in the 80s, he was predicting that 65 million Americans, which at that point I think was something like, 25% of the population of the United States, probably close to that, would die in again, the Great Die-Off because of, climate alarmism.
How many was it?
He said 65 million. So what was the total population of the
That's
US?
a quarter, almost a
quarter,
third.
about 25%, yeah. All right. Here's another great one. Oxford professor Aramis Wilson in 1878 said, when the Paris exhibition closes, electric light will close with it and no more will be heard of it.
That might be my favorite one. I've never heard that.
The next one's your favorite. Admit it. In fact, Christian, I'm going to give you the honor of reading off this next one.
Oh man, this is.
In fact, don't tell the name. Just
okay.
Nobel Prize winning economist.
Nobel Prize winner has multiple degrees in economics too.
Yes.
He said, and this is in 1998. This is an actual quote. In fact, this is such an insane quote that people don't believe it's an actual quote. Yeah. It is. He said in 1998, the growth of the internet will slow drastically, as the flaw in Metcalfe's law, which states that the number of potential connections in a network is proportional to the square of the number of participants, becomes apparent. Most people have nothing to say to each other. By 2005 or so, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than the fax machines.
And who was it?
It was our good old friend Paul Krugman.
Paul Krugman.
Who to this day is heralded as an expert in the field of economics. And by the way, that is the most obvious wrong thing that he said. But I mean, this is the guy that was still, just a few years ago, was like, there's no Fed-induced bubble in the markets. The real problem is we're under threat of deflation.
Yeah. This is Paul Krugman, Nobel. And again, if you define expertise in almost purely academic means, which is to say that he has the appropriate degrees, he has the appropriate awards, he's written the appropriate papers, he's an expert. But if you look at it as how have his predictions played out, especially the more ones that he's kind of famous for, he gets it wrong repeatedly. And then what's really interesting is that if you go back, he will write articles within a year to 2 years of each other and be on both sides of the issue, and then just reference his work on the one that he got right. And it's just amazing. It's just amazing. Okay, here's another one. Harrison Brown, a scientist at the National Academy of Science, published a chart in Scientific American that looked at metal reserves and estimated that humanity would totally run out of copper shortly after 2000, and lead, zinc, tin, gold, and silver would be gone before 1990. Now, again, this is another one of those areas where he's looking at current known reserves and making predictions. They do the same thing with oil all the time. We're going to run out of oil based off of current levels of consumption and known reserves until we find more reserves, or until we find ways to be more efficient. Like, people adapt. All right, here's another one. Let's go through this a little bit quicker. Lord Kelvin, president of the Royal Society in 1883, said X-rays will prove to be a hoax. All right. Senator Gaylord Nelson wrote in Look that Dr. S. Dillon Ripley, secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, believes that in 25 years, somewhere between 75 and 80% of all the species of living animals will be extinct. Kenneth Watt warned about a pending ice age. This is in the 70s. The world has been chilling sharply for about 20 years. If present trends continue, the world would be about 4 degrees colder for the global mean temperature in 1990, but 11 degrees colder in the year 2000. This is about twice what it would take to put us into an ice age.
Well, he did cover himself by saying, if present trends continue.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Malthus, again, Malthus is the one we talked about. He's kind of the original, doomsday guy on this stuff. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. That was how Malthus was going to deal with population
This
booms.
sounds like leftists right now wanting high-density housing.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one by, again, our good old friend Paul Elric. I would take even money that England will not exist in the year 2000.
It'll just be Thanos snapped away, right?
Okay, here's a good one. I love this one. We will never make a 32-bit operating system. Bill Gates.
The man who makes a 64-bit operating system. I mean, he proved himself wrong in some ways.
Yeah. Here's another good. Here's a government expert. Here's another government expert that I love. T. Craven, FCC commissioner in 1961, said there is practically no chance communication space satellites will be used to provide better telephone, telegraph, television, or radio service inside the United States. That was the head of the SCC. Oh, Lord Kelvin, another one from Lord Kelvin, British mathematician and physicist, president of the British Royal Society, said in 1895, heavier than air flying machines are impossible. Now keep in mind, less then 80 years later, we'd be walking on the moon.
Kelvin also said that there was only 400 years of oxygen left.
I kind of wonder how he could say something like that when he's probably physically actually seen birds, and birds are heavier than air. So why?
That's actually a really good point now that I think about it.
He said machine.
I mean, but he's equating all of it down to weight.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Sir William Preece, chief engineer of the British Post Office, said that Americans have need of the telephone, but we do not. We have plenty of messenger boys.
Because we are the British
He
aristocracy.
said that in 1878. All right, and here is, we're rounding it up with this one because I just love this one. Charles Dewell, commissioner of the U.S. Office of Patents, said in 1899, everything that can be invented has been invented.
Wow.
I remember that one.
These are your government academic and private sector experts.
You know, it's interesting because the one back a little bit about the telephone and the messenger boys. I would not be surprised if there weren't people saying they're going to put these messenger boys out of business and they're going to starve in the streets if we get this new technology.
I've got a couple ones from my good friend Jim Cramer.
Okay.
Who is so popular for being so wrong so many times. He's the host of Mad Money on CNBC. Yeah. He makes these like pronouncements and then they end up being like the exact opposite happens. And it's so repeatable that there's literally a Twitter account that's called the Inverse Cramer ETF that just tells you to invest in the opposite of what he's saying. And it's actually up this year. It's up like 22% year to date.
Oh, wow.
At the same time, the market's down. But like, there's two quotes from Jim Cramer that I think are like incredible. One was from July 2020, where Jim Cramer said, "I'm sick and tired of hearing that we're in a bubble and that Jerome Powell's overinflating the price of stocks by printing money to keep the economy moving." That was literally exactly what was happening at the time.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. And the more famous one, probably the single most famous one, I actually sent Hamilton the link to it. If we don't want to play it here, that's fine. But it was March 11th, 2008. It was an episode of Mad Money, and Jim Cramer was talking about there was a thing that happened in 2008, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Bit of a housing bubble.
Jim Cramer was asked about what was going on in the financial sector, and he ended up being asked about Bear Stearns.
Okay.
And he ended up saying, don't pull your money out of Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns is fine. And are you actually okay?
No.
And it was literally 9 days later that Bear Stearns went under.
Dang.
When he said, "Don't pull your money out of Bear Stearns, it's fine."
Well, I remember when, who was the Congress? Barney Frank. Barney Frank, because it was Chris Dodd and Barney Frank were the ones that were like just pumping up the real estate market with these. It was the subprime mortgages. It was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as there was a public-private partnership. They were creating just massive perverse incentives within the economy. And it was interesting because some people were getting mad at a lot of like the private sector, banks and the real estate market and whatnot. And some of it was justified because some of them were lobbying for all this money because they knew they'd get the bailout. But the other thing is that when the government creates a perverse incentive within the marketplace, it actually can be damaging to you as a business if you don't participate. Not only because of the short-term economic gains that are created in that time for a particular industry, but also because people like Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, they weren't just saying, we want you to do these subprime mortgages. They were saying, and if you don't, we will investigate you for denying loans to certain groups. Right? They were basically saying you're denying loans because you're racist. Wow. And so we're going to require this, but then we're also going to set up this exchange with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to where now they were handing all these subprime mortgages and the private sector banks was like, these are not good mortgages. So what would they do? They'd bundle them up, right? And then they'd sell those mortgages to somebody else. Well, who bought it? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And what were they buying it with? In part, public dollars, tax dollars.
Wow.
So the reason I say this is because Barney Frank then came back. He was quoted as saying, we want to roll the dice a little longer on this. And then the housing market tanked and you had all these people losing their homes. It was horrible. And then they went right back. Who do you think they came back to fix it? Barney Frank and Chris Dodd. Yeah. Because they yelled the loudest about this is wrong and I can't believe the banks are doing it. Well, everyone was really mad at the banks, right? And there was some good reason to be mad at them. Everyone was really mad at the banks, but the banks were actually responding to what Chris Dodd and Barney Frank had essentially either legally required or incentivized them to do. And then Barney Frank and Chris Dodd come out and be like, "Oh, we're going to fix this. This is unacceptable."
That's always the way they do.
What's that scene from The Boys where one of the guys like does something bad, but like he comes up and everyone's cheering and is like, all right, yeah, yeah. It's like he's the one like responsible for. I haven't seen the show, but I just seen that the clip and it's kind of funny. But anyway, so that's our. Actually, I think we had 21 examples in there, so you got a bonus example.
We got a bonus in there. Well, Nick, here's the question I have.
Yeah.
Should we just ignore the experts?
No. This is the part where, again, the pendulum always swings, right? You have some people, the extreme on one side is trust the experts. What's an expert? I don't know, somebody with a PhD that says things that sound good to me, right? No, you shouldn't do that. And then the other side is you shouldn't trust any of these people. Like, no, expertise is valuable.
The extreme on the opposite end, to give you an idea, is the CDC recommends washing your hands.
Yeah.
I will never wash my hands ever again. That would
yeah.
be like the extreme opposite.
Yeah. Hey, you should brush your
Yeah.
teeth. You mean like Hitler who brushed his teeth?
Experts, the experts who were wrong on COVID also recommended brushing your teeth at least once a day.
Yeah.
I'm never going to do that. Like,
Well, I remember. I'm old enough to remember when Dr. Fauci was saying you're more likely to catch COVID if you wear a mask because
Yeah.
you'll be adjusting it and touching it all the time.
Yeah.
And that was all because there was a mask shortage at that point, and they wanted to save
least
all
that's
those
what he
masks
came
for
back later
medical
and said.
professionals. And then once the market responded and all of these masks were made, they were like, "Well, how dare you not wear a mask? You want grandma to die."
Yeah. No, it's so, look, it's like anything else. Expertise can be valuable. Expertise can be horribly wrong. Thomas Sowell has this quote where he said, it seems like every major disaster in American history has a Harvard man behind it, right? Because experts do have the ability of using the influence that they do as a result of their acknowledged expertise to make really bad decisions, either based off of incomplete information or because they have some sort of motivation that we might not know about that is influencing them. And so really what it comes down to is you can pick the experts that you think have a good track record of being correct. And then you can use them as a heuristic, right? You can use them as a shortcut. Like, okay, I don't have time to study open heart surgery. So if I need an open heart surgery, I'm going to go to somebody that has a lot of expertise and experience successfully providing open heart. Now there might be, if I have two open heart surgeons, right? If I have two surgeons, and one of them has got multiple PhDs and has been in the university for the past 30 years. And the other one is narrowly focused on performing heart surgery, and they've been performing heart surgery for the next 30 years. We can have a debate on which one of those people is more of an expert, but I'll tell you the one I want performing my heart surgery is the one that's been doing it for the last 30 years. So there's a good combination. Again, this goes into another Thomas Sowell quote where he says, one of the dumbest things that you can do is put decisions in the hands of people that pay no price for being wrong. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to look at when somebody is offering up advice, what price do they pay for being wrong? What is their level of expertise? Is it a very narrow field that they're now using to try to influence a broader field? Or do they have a track record of being consistently correct and also humble enough to understand that their level of expertise doesn't mean that they can automatically impose decisions on hundreds of millions, if not billions of people?
And are there perverse incentives to come to a specific conclusion?
I just thought about this. Even the heart surgeon has to carry medical malpractice insurance.
Yeah.
Because if they mess something up,
well, and again,
they're responsible
if
for
you
it.
say, if you're a heart surgeon and I need brain surgery, are you the right person to talk to?
No.
No, you may know basic fundamentals of surgery that apply equally, like things like you got to wash your hands, you got to scrub up, you got to be in a sanitary room, you got to use these sorts of tools. But that doesn't mean that their expertise in one narrow field of medicine does not convey expertise across all fields of medicine.
Right.
Yeah. And look, the same applies to us sitting at this table and anyone watching this. All right, you should like what we have to say on a topic or take it as being meaningful, understanding what our relative expertise is in the room. But ultimately do the arguments that we make sense? Are they logically consistent?
Right.
Are they logically reasonable? And is the evidence and data that we use to justify our conclusions, right? Does it play out in reality? And then the third thing that I would say is also look at what are people suggesting based off. You're going to notice that in almost every conclusion we come to, we err on the side of let individuals have as much evidence and information and access as possible, whether it be to the market, whether it be to information, and then let them make their own decisions. Now, we will have suggestions from time to time on what we think is the best decision or course of action, but you'll notice we're never advocating shutting down somebody else's ability to contradict us or to disagree with us, nor are we suggesting that you should do something exclusively because Nick Freitas, said so.
Yeah.
It's also worth noting that nobody at this table is advocating for giving us more power over people's individual lives.
The opposite.
And we even have an elected politician in the room.
And we have somebody who has the ability to advocate for that if he so wanted.
And we're not getting money in order to come up with a certain conclusion.
To tell people.
Well, here's the question that I have regarding this subject. Obviously, we've seen this, trust the experts be challenged within the political space, especially around COVID. But where else do y'all see this playing out in just everyday life when it comes to questioning authority?
I mean, I gave the example of Jim Cramer earlier.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, that was something close to my heart personally. And so, like, that's an example. I think there's so many examples in the markets and in the broader economy. I know that we've talked mostly about the government sector, but like, there's so many examples. I brought this up at the beginning of this podcast that, like, people who, because they're successful themselves or because they have degrees in certain fields, they then make pronouncements about what they think is going to happen to the broader economy. And it's not just that they're going to make pronouncements about predictions. They will sometimes offer policy solutions, so to speak. And those solutions almost always involve more power. And it's like, here's an example. Plato's ideal form of government was shockingly philosopher kings who ended up ruling all of society. Yeah. Like, is it really any surprise that Plato, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, said, oh man, philosophers should be the ones running the world? Like,
Neil deGrasse Tyson thinks scientists should be the one.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that Plato's an idiot. Yeah. Right? That doesn't mean that there's no value to be obtained from reading Plato or following any of his advice. Like, there's plenty of things that he writes about that are great. I mean, we still read his works thousands of years later. But nobody's out there saying, yeah, we need people like Plato to be running everything. Yeah. Like there's we just need to realize that sometimes people who appear to be experts or might actually be experts in certain fields that are worthy of respect in certain areas. A, that doesn't mean that they're right 100% of the time. And B, that doesn't mean that they themselves might not have some personal motives or interests in pushing for certain positions or policies that might be beneficial to them or their positions.
Well, I think the beautiful thing about the free market is that it allows everyone to be experts in individual areas, and they can succeed in those individual areas. But that expertise may not be transferable to another area, and therefore you hire other people who are experts in those areas. But when you try and bring all these experts into a government agency, when they've only been an expert or educated in one area, and then try and extrapolate that experience out to multiple things, it doesn't work. But the free market says there's a better way of doing it.
Well, yeah, again, Thomas Sowell used to say that one of the big problems of putting concentrating the power in the hands of a few people is that even if they're the smartest people with access to all the data, they still don't have a fraction of the consequential knowledge that goes into everyday decisions that billions of people are making across the globe. So, yeah, if you want to treat people like they're nothing more than a column on an Excel spreadsheet, you can potentially predict out what they need, what they want, and what sort of organization or production would be necessary to achieve it. The problem is you can't effectively do that. And so you end up making massive problems and creating shortages. And a lot of times what happens is once the people have that sort of power to make those sorts of decisions, they want to keep it. And the things that they're willing to do to keep it and the things that they're willing to justify to keep it become increasingly horrific. So I want to leave everybody with one last thought on this, and that's this. The answer is not to throw out expertise. The answer is to understand where an expert is coming from, what their experience is, what their education is, before you just take whatever they say for granted. The other thing that I would tell everybody to do, whenever you're gauging an expert's opinion on a particular topic, ask yourself this. Is the conclusion that they regularly come to concentrating power in the hands of a relatively small number of people that look and think just like them? If it is, you should be wary of that.
Yep.
All right, well, if you found this episode helpful, if you found one of the examples we used to be incredibly insightful or surprising, please let us know on social media or in our Volley chat. Also, if you think we got it wrong, let us know that as well, because unlike some other areas, we will never try to shut down dissenting opinion. Once again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next episode.